My name is Dr. Ehsan Latif, and I work for the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease. I'll be talking mainly about tobacco control, but also as tobacco control one of the main risk factors for the NCDs, and it is also linked to tuberculosis. I won't go into much of the clinical details of it, but how we have used the experience of looking at the different public health problems and then trying to translate into policy, and also the translation of policy into practice. I'll share some slides with you on what the union is and what we do within the union. The union was established almost 90 years ago, and our work has primarily been on tuberculosis and lung health. We credit ourselves with formulating the DOTS therapy, which was then taken over by or handed over to the World Health Organization, and our scientists and consultants were pioneers in developing that therapy for tuberculosis. The mission of the union is that we want to bring innovation, expertise, solutions, and support to address public health challenges in the low and middle income populations. Now, when you define those, then you are looking at different kinds of diseases under lung health, and TB and tobacco gain prominence under that. We don't restrict ourselves to the people who live in those countries, but mainly target the communities which are economically, not only economically poor, but also don't get enough treatments or access to health care. So our vision is health solutions for the poor. And we are governed by the values in the union of quality, accountability, independence, and solidarity for the people that we work for and in all the diseases. So what is the union? Union is an institute. We've got 14 offices worldwide with 5 scientific departments looking at different disease patterns. But we are also a federation with constituent members, organizational members, and individual members who vote on different things and keep us going. So the different departments that we are working under are the 5 scientific departments. We look at tuberculosis, we do tobacco control, HIV/AIDS is another major program, research, lung health, and NCD. So you can see, but research is not an independent, it is an independent department, but then it cuts across all the other work that we are doing. So when you start talking about research, and when you're talking about how does it translate into policy and then practice, what you need to do is to really assess yourself first and whether you are the right organization in undertaking that program. Are you the right people who can take up that research, look at it, and then translate into policy? So how do we do that? How can we form the conduit between those different streams? The first thing that we thought about ourselves is that with all these offices, not just the physical presence of these offices across the globe in 14 countries, but also for tobacco control in all the 5 WHO represented regions, what we have is access to the governments, access to the policymakers, to the different stakeholders, and we already have that physical infrastructure available to us to reach them. And what that infrastructure helps us to do is to gain knowledge of the in-country, regional, and international environment for tobacco control. So the structure of the union with the researchers, the scientific departments, helps each other to provide those links and to develop that knowledge. It's easy to work with the civil society. It's easy to work with the universities and when you're talking about public health, because they are concerned, they are committed, they are quite vigilant about the things which are happening in this world under public health. But when you talk about the governments, it's a different scenario altogether. So you need to have expertise on how do you talk to a minister of health or a secretary of health or a government department, which is very different from how would you approach a university, a research institute, or a civil society organization. And we looked at ourselves, we said, well, under the tuberculosis work that we have done for the last 90 years, we think we have the expertise on how to talk with the policymakers and how to talk with the governments, and we have those established relationships. Capacity building is, it can be just limited to undertaking a workshop, ticking the boxes and saying, well, we have trained 12 people, 14 people, or 14,000 people this year. But what that also means is that are you continuing to build that relationship with those people? Are you, after those workshops, the training sessions, continuing to provide the technical assistance which keeps them abreast with what is happening in this world? What is happening with that public health issue? And in our case, tobacco control. I'll talk about capacity building later on in the slides, also in how we look at it as a cornerstone of our work of translating research into policy and practice. And then you're not alone. You have to develop partnerships. Again, it is very relative into research, translation of research into policy and practice. What you have to do is you can't work with one stream of folks. You need to have different stakeholders and you need to develop those partnerships. So the way you work with the governments has to correspond to the way you bring the civil society on board, the way you bring the researchers on board, and the way you work with other stakeholders, but not forgetting the people that you're really working for. Bring those people on board as well. And then you need to look at the international changes, the international trends, what is happening in this world. How, for example, the NCDs are gaining prominence now. The research tells us that it's bigger than the infectious diseases. It's not saying that my issue is bigger than yours. It's not a comparison, but you need to have a hand on the pulse of where the international trends are going and what's happening and what are the international agencies and governments interested in. Now I'm going to narrow down on tobacco control now. Because in tobacco control, it's been decades that we have known the scientific research. You have proven beyond doubt, researchers have proven beyond doubt that tobacco use is harmful. It causes diseases, and you name any part of the body, and you can link it with tobacco use, and that body part is harmed by, ranging from the obvious ones like lung cancers and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, to impotence, to passive health smoke, secondhand smokes, to effects on children, to sudden infant death syndrome. So you name the disease and you can link it, the research has linked it to tobacco use, both in the primary user and also in the secondary user. So what's stopping us? What is happening? So you've got clinical studies, you've got effects of tobacco consumption, you've got different epidemiological studies, you notice trends, you do cohorts, there's been decades of people being monitored on tobacco use, you've got economic models. Remember, tobacco is not only about the health hazards. It has got its social costs, it's got its economic costs. So it becomes a health issue, primarily because it affects your health, but that effect on health leads to different debates which are about what is the economic cost, what is going to happen to the farmers, what is going to happen on the taxation and the revenues earned by the government, what is going to happen to the employment of different folks. So the research has to focus on provision of all this data for tobacco control, and we were lucky to have it. The first report by the World Bank and World Health Organization on tobacco control, maybe some of you have seen it, or perhaps all of you have seen it, Curbing the Epidemic, brought everything into perspective, that tobacco control is multifaceted. It's an economic issue, social issue, health issue, and it needs to be looked at. And we were very fortunate that World Health Organization, supported by the civil society and all its 192 member states at that time, took on tobacco control and provided us with a solution. So we had on one side all this research about the effects of economy, on the effects of personal health, on the effects of the social injustices which were happening, why it was affecting mainly the poor, and while on the other side, we started to develop what works for tobacco control, and all that is encapsulated in the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control. So this was the first health treaty negotiated under the auspices of World Health Organization. And it gives you measures to control tobacco use, to decrease the effects of tobacco use, and it gives you both the supply and demand side. People look at these two, but there is a third one also. It also looks at the general guiding principles on how the governments should react to tobacco control, how while looking at this reduction of supply, they need to look at the reduction on the demand, but they also need to look at what are the things that they should be doing in order to make these two ends work together. So research on one side, what works on the other. And if you look at today's topic, it says translating research into policy and practice. For me, that is very important because in developed countries, like here in Scotland, when you passed a law which said no smoking in public places, it was automatic the next day. You had your rules and regulations, and it started to enforce itself. There were some time delays, there were some things, there were some challenges, but in general practice, what you see is that once a law is passed in a developed country, you have a maximum chance of seeing it enforced in the areas that it is looking at. Health warnings, yes, you still have health warnings which are bigger. You need to move towards plain packaging. But then again, you know the progress is happening, and the civil society, the researchers, keeps the stakeholders, the policymakers, and everybody abreast of what is happening. But when you go and work in a low and middle income country, the translation of research and policy can happen. You can talk to a few people and start developing policy, but you want to implement that policy, that becomes a challenge. So you got not one step of translating research into policy and practice, you've got a two-step process that you have to translate the research into policy and then policy into practice. So this next slide really shows not the theoretical background of how you can translate research, and I think as all of public health students, we studied at some stage of our lives when we were doing public health in the universities. These steps are mainly from the experience that we have had of working within the union on tobacco control for the last 6-7 years now. The first thing that you need to do is for any debate, and here, for example, the tobacco control, you need to really list down who your stakeholders are. You need to identify them. And once you know your stakeholders and you've identified them, you recognize the challenges which need to be addressed. You need to look at the data which once you present it to a civil society organization, they can run away with it. They are already committed in doing it. But once you take it to the policymaker, he'll come back or she'll come back with 10 other questions. And they'll be bogged down with more research. And then when you take those research answers back to the policymakers, you'll get 10 more. So the list keeps growing and growing. So you need to present this data to the thinking on what the next questions are going to be. How are you going to address the concerns that all these stakeholders have? For example, are you looking at under tobacco control when you say secondhand smoke kills? Are you looking at the ultimate question on what is it going to do to the farmer who's working in a field? It is linked, but then you need to present it in a manner which is digestible by the policymakers. And then you also need to have, when you're talking about these changes, that a researcher is the best person to do the research. It's quite obvious. They know the epidemiological methods, they know the scientific methods, they'll prove it beyond any doubt that these p-values do count. but are they the ones who should go and talk to the policymakers? They might be the right advocates, but then again you need to have a consultative process on whether the university, with its credibility, with its proven relationships with the governments, the people, your health minister might have studied in your university, and that university professor is the right person to go and talk to the health minister, but maybe he's not or she's not the only one to do it. So you need to have a consultative process, and that's what we learned practically on the ground, that if you want to translate research into policy, you need to have a consultation on who your champion is, who is the right person who's going to take this data from the researcher, the excellent work done by them, by the universities, and then take it to the policymakers and other stakeholders. And then again, once you take this data, you're aiming for an ideal world. What you're looking at is that you need to ban smoking areas across the board. You don't need any designated smoking areas. You want to raise the tax that it's unaffordable for the poor. You're looking at comprehensive advertising bans. You're looking at doing policies which are written and can be compliant to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But then again, you need to see what the governments are looking at. You need to see what the concerns of the policymakers are. So you need to patch the policies with the laws, the best practices, and say, if it can be done in that country, why can't it be done in yours? If it can be done in your neighboring country, it can spill over in your country as well. So you need to develop those examples. So you need to match policies. And there will always be gaps. And you should be prepared to give an argument when you're translating research into policy on what those gaps are, and be upfront about it. And that's what we learned, that when they talk about agriculture, ultimately, whenever you go and talk about tobacco control, it ends up into economic losses, job losses. What is my vote bank going to do? We are living in downturn, very hard times economically. You want me to lose more jobs, what is my vote bank going to say? But then you need to be upfront and say, look, it's not going to happen now. It's going to happen years later. It's going to happen eventually, but you have enough time. It's not going to happen in the next 1 hour or 2 hours after you pass the policy. There is always a gap period. And you need to be ready with the answers when you go. You need to be sure on saying, agriculture, yes, it will be affected ultimately, but right now it's not a priority. So you need to keep coming with those answers, and it goes back to the second point we said, recognize the challenges which need to be addressed. Recognize the things which will come up when you're trying to translate this research into policies. And then again, there are bigger countries in this world. There are huge, huge populations in some of the countries that we work in. I'll be giving you examples from China, India, Russia, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, which are the top 5 countries with the highest tobacco users, and countries which are suffering from tobacco hazards as well. So when you talk about the whole of China or the whole of India, India has got countries within a country. You look at every state is different. You move from south to north, east to west. Even the languages are not common. So do you want to take the whole of India in one go, or do you prioritize on creating models and saying, look, this model is working? And what we have learned in our practice is, I'm not saying start small. What I'm saying is that on one side, you have to have that idealistic approach of making everything Framework Convention and Tobacco Control compliant matches with it, while you also need to create some small models to build up the capacity and the confidence within the people rightly concerned with it to show that it works. Because if you don't do that, we again come up into this discussion on, does this work, will it happen, or what are going to be the effects? And then you can expand nationally. Again, these points are not taken from any theoretical book on public health. These are the things that we learned while doing it on the ground. So you then, once you've created these models, you expand nationally and then perhaps regionally as well, because most of the countries in that region share the same cultural norms. They tend to share the same economic environments. The next thing to do is to look at some examples on how we approached different countries and utilize the points that I gave to you earlier in the earlier slide. China, a huge country. 1/3 of, I think, all tobacco users live in one country. Current users of smoked tobacco is 28.1%. These are the latest figures from the World Health Organization report 2011. Now, China is a party to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, but China is unique in that sense that the tobacco industry is a state monopoly. So on one side, you're talking to the national government and saying you need to do something about tobacco use, while the other arm of the government is promoting tobacco because it wants to earn more revenues and profits through the industry that it owns. So China presents its own unique problems when you talk about tobacco control. So tobacco is and once you look at it, you can go and talk to the ministers of health. They've changed recently from being a Ministry of Health to being a Commission on Family Welfare and Health. So we are told that the status is still the same, but it's no longer called the Ministry of Health. It's called the Commission on Family Welfare, Family Welfare and Health. So there is limited political will to undertake tobacco control. So once you go into that kind of a country, what do you do? What do you look at? If the national government is not moving, or you feel that you get this sense that you'll be struggling to get anywhere in the next couple of years or in the next foreseeable future, what do? You go subnationally and start looking at creating those models so that you can build enough critical mass to make sure that the national debates start to happen. This is what the approach that we took in China. So we started with a city-level approach while working nationally with the Centers of Disease Control in China, establishing a national office for tobacco control. The official National Office of Tobacco Control is right now placed in the Ministry of Information Technology and Industry. So that is also the ministry which governs the tobacco industry. And the delegation that they sent to the Framework Convention negotiations always has the tobacco industry representative in it. So what do? You go subnationally, you try to create models, and by doing that approach, following the earlier points that I said, the progress that we have seen is that tobacco control is now included in the 5-year health plan in China. We've got 5 cities. They may not be the major cities in China like Beijing or Shanghai, but you've got 5 cities who have comprehensive smoke-free laws now, and they are implementing it. We are working, the union is working in 10 cities. There are other partners, Gates Foundations and others, who are working in a multiple of other cities as well through Red Cross and other organizations. So national legislation is now being debated. We are currently in a process on how to support the newly formed commission to undertake work on national legislation. And then again, the universities are involved. So you've got compulsory tobacco control courses in medical and public health curriculum, more than 35 and others are underway. And the other, 2 minutes, better run quickly then. Then you have to have local government funding for smoke-free legislation. India, the same thing, but a different approach. India is very proactive in tobacco control, but then again, it faced challenges from the tobacco industry. So the approach that we had for India was slightly different because they had a comprehensive tobacco control law in place. So you didn't need to go and talk to the policy makers of adopting a policy. What you needed to do was to make sure the adequate funds were allocated by India for the implementation of the policy, and that is the work that we have been doing. Frank told me, Professor John Frank earlier, that he's going to be harsh, and he said 2 minutes, so I need to go through these slides pretty quickly. So our strategy was implementation, and the progress that you can see on the slides is that you've got more and more jurisdictions properly implementing the law. As I said earlier, it's not normal practice, it's not comes naturally, because you need to provide the infrastructure. Indonesia, again, a country very resistant to any change. It's not even signed the FCTC, but that hasn't stopped us. So again, like China, we took a subnational approach. The progress has been that we have been able to form a mayors alliance. So all the mayors of all the cities, it's now up to 64 mayors have joined an alliance to support tobacco control. So you apply different approaches on how you want to translate this research into policy. This was not supposed to happen, but then again, Russia, again, a very difficult country to work in. But the use of data here is very important because you've got a very restrictive environment in Russia. You cannot, there was a recent law and a move within the Putin government of restricting civil society movements within Russia. And all of us have been very careful in how we approach tobacco control because it can be seen as lobbying and Western agenda as far as Russia is concerned. So, but again, when the first GATS data was released, when Mr. Putin looked at the mortality data in a decreasing population in Russia, he became concerned because that's how the data was presented to him. And he started talking about tobacco control, and a concept was released by Mr. Putin, which was in October last year translated into a law, which is one of the most comprehensive laws for tobacco control in the region. But our strategy was to have national champions, to remain in the background so that that research could be translated into policy. Bangladesh, again, a difficult country to work in, but then again, where you don't see a state monopoly and you don't see a lot of resistance from the policymakers and a very vibrant civil society. So you don't hold back anything, and you go for an all-out advocacy in such countries so that your research is translated. And the success that we had there was that the cabinet endorsed the tobacco control law in August, and it was approved by Parliament in 2013. Now, last slide. As I said in the first slide, that we'll approach capacity building in a very serious manner. It's not ticking off boxes where we say that we have trained so many people or undertaken 20 workshops or X number of workshops across the globe. What we think is that capacity building is the heart of everything that we do. You can start at anywhere in this circle. You can look at political commitment. If you want to gain political commitment of translating that research or undertaking tobacco control, you need to present the data so that the policymaker can understand it. You can publish papers, but what are the chances of that policymaker reading that paper? So you need to build their capacity to understand what you are saying. Legislation and policies are developed and adapted, but are they compliant, or are they mirroring the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control? So again, capacity building remains at the heart of it. And then you can keep on going. The allocation of resources. Most of the ministries of health, and I'm sure you are more aware of this, they want to undertake school education programs. They want to take stop smoking in minors, do not sell cigarettes by minors. But then, again, your research and evidence shows they don't work. So you need to raise their capacity to understand that our research has shown if you want to have a least impact tobacco control policy, go and work on a health education program in children or in children's schools. That doesn't work. You need to hit them hard on where it really matters. And then You don't need to develop a parallel process for tobacco control or any other public health problem. You need to use what is already in place to maximize resources. And evaluation is key to it as well. You need to have proper evaluations so that you can go back to look at whether you have been able to do the first step. You can start anywhere in this cycle, but then again, at the union, we are very committed to this capacity building, not as a one-off, but a continuous process of providing technical assistance to the people that we work with, the institutions, the organizations, the countries, and transregionally as well. Thank you very much for your time.